And we are back. You are chatting with John P. Today we are going to be discussing watch stereotypes. Now, not necessarily the stereotypes of specific watches, though we will be talking about some very familiar brands, of course. This is a watch channel. But what we're actually going to be discussing is the stereotypes of watch collectors or watch guys or watch savants, whatever you want to call them, guys that like watches, including myself, including my business partner, Federico, DelReyWatch.com. By the way, check it out, DelReyWatch.com. We got some pretty cool stuff in stock. We're always adding new pieces, and do not forget to like and subscribe. You know I appreciate it, and it keeps me going. Let's do this, guys. So, watch stereotypes. Now, I was thinking before doing this video, do I really want to do this video? Do I want to stir the pot? Because without a doubt, I'm probably going to offend one or two of you, but I don't think that you should be offended, right? These are just stereotypes. It doesn't mean they're always true, and it doesn't mean that necessarily they're true most of the time, but based on my experience with Del Rey Watch and also having collected and flipping and trading for roughly 10 years and knowing many dealers in the industry and many people and answering calls all the time, these are kind of my findings. Now, if maybe you fit one of these, but it doesn't totally fit you, perfectly fine. No harm is meant at all. Leave in the comments below. Let me know what you think, and avoid the thumbs down. Like, just let me know in the comments, and we can avoid talking about these things in the future if for some reason you are offended. So, not trying to offend anyone if you feel that way, but we need to talk about some stereotypes of watch collectors. So let's get into it. So the first category, and I have a list here, excuse me, is new to watches. Now, there's a bit of a journey or a path of the typical watch collector, and there's some images surfacing around all over on the internet, and if I can find it, I'll post it here so you can see it. But basically, there's kind of a journey of when you first start collecting watches and the brands you get into and how you ultimately start, get into Rolex quickly, and then you go up to some other brands, come back down to Rolex. But one thing for certain in that curve, it's not always true, but in that curve, one thing for certain is kind of the watches that you get started looking at when you're new to watches. When you're very new to watches, I'm talking, a couple weeks, maybe a couple months tops, you don't know all the brands, you don't know all the terms, you don't know all the quality. Even myself, when I first started out, there's just so much in the watch world, and many, many people take that for granted just because they've been doing this so long. And I'll see sometimes at watch events where a guy will say, well, how don't you know about, Elan Gonzona? And he'll say that to a new watch collector. And it's like, well, come on, not only is it a very high-end, high-dollar, high-ticket item, it's not like there's advertising everywhere compared to something like Rolex. So you have to give the new guys benefit of the doubt. But what I see with new guys is they're very eager to learn, and not only that, they're drawn to great value. When you first start watch collecting, even myself, you don't realize how expensive things can get, and you kind of feel like it's almost like a sham, right? Like, why is this watch $50,000 and this watch is $1,000? Like, I get the $1,000, but how can you create all this value? And so we won't talk about it because it's a given, it's true, it's fact. There is value in higher priced watches, but it's something to consider when you think about the new collector. And the new collector, in my experience, is drawn to great value. So first, they would like to squeeze into a Rolex, but they don't really think it's worth it yet, right? Like, if they're truly a watch collector, a watch guy, they almost have to prove it to themselves that the value is there. It's kind of something that goes along with watches, is kind of forcing yourself to jump a little bit deeper into pulling back the covers and really seeing what the certain watches are about. So some typical brands, Tag Heuer, Nomos, maybe if they've read a few articles, you read an article on Hodinkee or some other site that says like Nomos is a great value in-house movement, certain buzzwords jump out at you. So Nomos, maybe a Tag Heuer, maybe an Omega if you can squeeze into it, certainly pre-owned. And also newer guys into watches many times are drawn to vintage because of the value, right? You can get an Omega, you can get a Rolex for under $2,000, you can get an Omega for sometimes $500. So vintage, but as well as Omega, Rolex, but also great value. So, some Longines, some Nomos, watches in that category, stereotypical new to watch collecting. So the next one. Oh, and by the way, not talking down about any of those brands or any of those people, perfectly fine, we all start there. Casual. Now this is probably, when you think about the total number of people in the world that have a watch or have purchased a luxury watch, this is probably the majority of the makeup of those people, most of the population of people that have purchased a luxury watch. And it's not because certain regions or demographics, or people that just don't want to care about what they're buying. It's not it. It's just when you think about the total number of watches in the world and the luxury watches, not everybody is on the internet, talking, and not everybody is here. Not everybody goes out of their way to watch videos and go on the forums and discover these brands. And most brands have horrible marketing, so people aren't going to know about it. But the average guy that wants a luxury watch, that steps off his boat, steps off the golf course, perhaps he's finally made it to middle level management or something higher, or his business takes off, he's going to be searching for something like a Rolex. If he's a little bit younger, maybe he's going to get into an Hublot, sometimes even Audemars Piguet, if he's made it a little bit further, or his budget's a little bit higher, so maybe he'll squeeze himself into an AP. And so outside of AP, Hublot, Rolex, maybe Omega, if he did a little bit of research, those are going to be brands that are kind of circling around the casuals, as they call them. All great brands, stable brands, but high marketing and have been around for quite some time, with the exception of Hublot, that solely is marketing. So the casual guys, you'll see those watches. Moving on to the next type of watch collector. Okay, this is the movement buff. This is what I call the movement buff category. Now, there's a certain type of guy, and I see it all the time. They call in Delray Watch. They, perhaps they own an engineering firm, like one gentleman that I'm thinking of. They own an engineering firm, or perhaps they're just really into watches and they have the budget. They've saved up for it. They're an older guy. Maybe they come from a little bit of money. They are drawn to a Zona, right, the German manufacturer, very high-end, very highly decorated movements, completely in-house, very, very high-end watches. You have to know pretty much what you're doing, and you have to seek them out to find those true high-end, very intricate, superlative movements. But as well, we have FP Journe, right? FP Journe is not a guy off the streets watch. It's not your average, everyman's, Rolex comparable. FP Journe is very high quality. Everything is totally decorated, very high end, very limited run, limited production, we're talking about works of art, works of precision machinery at that point, more so than a watch. So the type of guy that goes out of his way to pay 30, 40, 50, 60 and upwards, depending on the watch, thousands of dollars, basically for a watch that has a lot more time behind the knife, as well as just being a more complicated and intricate movement. That's a guy that appreciates the watch movement, right? Like, you're paying for the movement. Otherwise, you could have bought something else off the shelf that has equal polishing on the case. So that's kind of movement buff. There's other watches that qualify, right? Like Patek makes some extremely complicated movements as well that could draw this guy to it. But typically, I see the movement buff guy drawn to FP as well as A. Zona. Moving on to the next category. Okay, we have the conservative quality guy. Now, the conservative quality guy, I don't have a better term for it. Just this person I see when they call in, they're conservative with their choices in that they don't like things that are flashy, gaudy. They don't like huge cases. They like, your average, between 37 to 40 millimeter case size, depending on if it's a dress model or a sports model. But what they do care about is the quality and the craftsmanship. They don't necessarily need the best movements, the most intricate movements, but they need a certain level of finishing, fit and finish across the board on the watches, including the movements, that is also going to be a great value. So it's someone that does take a lot of time, care, and attention into putting together their collection and choosing the pieces. So typically these guys are drawn to Jaeger-LeCoultre, or Jaeger-LeCoultre, as some people have called me out. Jaeger-LeCoultre, JLC, or they're also drawn to Vacheron, and it's for two reasons, right? Their quality, right? I mean, Vacheron is a trinity. JLC is sometimes considered like the fourth wing of the trinity, right? The whole trinity of watches. Very high quality manufacturers, both JLC and Vacheron. Very long, rich history. So that checks off the box for those, those quality guys that also care about the value. And the value is coming from, unfortunately, they just don't hold great, value pre-owned and even sometimes new, right? You can get a pretty steep discount compared to something like a Patek or a Journe. But the quality is also there, right? Like, you're in the ring of high-end quality sometimes horology watches. So that's a guy that's drawn to usually Vacheron, Jaeger, sometimes some independents, right? Like sometimes a Hebring if he's drawn to some of the more independents, but usually it's JLC and Vacheron. They don't hold great value pre-owned. So you get it pre-owned and he's got great value and it's super high end. So that's the kind of guy that we see. It's not a lot of guys. It's a very small amount, but they're very particular and you can spot them. Typically I see guys in this category being, lawyers, but not the lawyers that handle, serious litigations and things like that. They're usually, documents lawyers. So, someone that works as legal counsel for a corporation or someone that's going to be doing a lot of paperwork, very meticulous, very down to the details kind of guy, or perhaps a brain surgeon. We'll get brain surgeons that really are drawn to JLC for the reasons mentioned, or perhaps it's a CPA that's been, practicing quite some time and it has amassed a little bit of wealth. So these are the guys that I see with those brands, and it's just, you can spot it every time. They always want to talk about the movement shots, and they want to see, make sure that all the details are there on the case, and they don't want to see that the bevels are removed, and they don't want to see that there's a little bit of scratches here or there, but they want to buy a pre-owned and they want the value. So it can be an interesting conversation, but as long as you got the watches, they certainly like that. So moving on to the next one. Okay, this is a tough one, guys. This is a very tough one. So you get kind of the rappers. We've worked with a couple of up-and-coming rappers. No one that's crazy on the charts that we know of. Maybe they purchased through proxy, but we don't really work with iced out watches. So this is the kind of like rapper musician category, and they're really drawn to blinged out watches, but not always. Certainly Patek, like a 5711 or something from the Nautilus line, is very, very hot in that community currently. And I'll say that we don't talk about it too much in the shop, because it's just not our target market, not our demographic. They don't really tend to be watch guys, but they're drawn to things that come up in pop culture, right? So they're drawn to Patek, that's really hot in pop culture right now. They're drawn to Rolex. It may have some ice on the bezel. It may not. There's varying opinions in the music community. I have some family that's in the music community as well as some friends, and I see the watches that a lot of these guys are wearing, and it does come down to like sports Patek models if they can swing it, but usually it's something like a Rolex Day-Date, maybe the larger one, maybe the classic one, depending on where the budget was and just what they liked at the time. But it's very rarely Rolex sports models, and it's almost always Rolex dress models, but ironically it's a Patek sports model. So kind of interesting how that works, but that's something that I've noticed, and short of that, there's not a whole lot more that I can say about that besides probably some Rolex Day-Dates as well as some Patek sports models, mostly Nautilus. Pop culture icons more so than caring about the movements and things like that. It's more about the aesthetic, the look, and kind of what it means to you as a buyer in kind of the music in the rap community. Okay, moving on to the next one. Okay. Oh boy. Okay. Now we don't work with too many of these particular, watch collectors, but it's an interesting breed, and it's really a breed of guys that have been created by the watch community. So this category I kind of call like the Nouveau Riche. It's usually a younger guy, so someone under 45. It could be even a little bit older depending on, where they are and what they do. Maybe they're in the art world. There's Art Basel here in Miami, and you see these guys a lot, and sometimes we work with them, but typically they're working directly with the manufacturers because they're drawn to brands like Richard Mille. And if you have enough pull and you have enough weight and you got the right connections and you have reached a certain pinnacle in that kind of community of guys that have, larger inheritances, or perhaps they're in the art world, or sometimes they're in the music scene, or they're producers. They're drawn to kind of larger, like FU type pieces. You know what I mean? Like statement pieces. And I'm not talking down about them because there's still some great watches by Richard Mille. But basically, it's Richard Mille. Sometimes Roger Dubuis, or sometimes it's something like from an Audemars Piguet, skeleton, high-end tourbillon manufacturer, something from the research, something from the research line at Patek with a sports model, something that basically costs a lot of money, but isn't kind of boring and old manny. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just something that's newer, vibrant. Even Tag Heuer has kind of tried aiming themselves at this market, and it's always like skeletonized or bright colors or something very artsy and very poppy, and it's something to kind of make a statement piece. And even Tag Heuer has tried aiming themselves by teaming up with Alec Monopoly, a very famous, pop, basically a pop icon. He's a painter, he's a street artist, and I'm pretty sure he was wearing basically Richard Mille, Rolex, all that stuff, and then Tag Heuer, popped him on board, and now they have these kind of flashy, watches for him that kind of aim at that, and they have affordable tourbillons. So if sometimes we get a guy calling up and maybe he isn't in Richard Mille territory where he doesn't want to spend the money, or he's newer, but he is kind of that guy where, he does take private jets and he does fly around and he does, maybe he has some type of stipend from his family with his business or something along those lines. And he leads a bit of a life of leisure, but sometimes have these interesting passion projects, and we'll get calls like, hey, my artwork finally took off at this gallery. I'm looking for Richard Mille. Can you help me find that? And most of the time, they're looking for something that needs to come from the manufacturer. But we also don't get too many of those calls as it is, because they do work directly with the manufacturer. And if you're in the know, then you need to work with the manufacturer or boutique to obtain most of those without totally getting bent over. So interesting nouveau category there. These people do exist, and we do get calls from them. So I know it's many people saying like who is buying these watches? Like, people buy these all the time, no problem. It happens. It's a little bit eye-opening, but then once you've been around it a while, it's just commonplace. And so these people do exist. These watches are sold, guys. Moving on to the next one. This is I feel that this is kind of a dying breed of watch guy, but it was probably one of the earliest of watch guys, and it's only because of the rise and fall of Breitling. And I do think that Breitling is rising and falling, but honestly, Breitling does make great hats. I personally don't wear Breitling anymore because I don't believe in what the brand recently did by dumping a lot of their stock and making the pre-owned prices really low. They do make quality watches, but I love their hats. Their hats, in my opinion, are better than their watches, compared to other hats, compared to other watches. But anyways, there's like a Breitling guy, and he kind of likes pilot, aeronautical themed things. And this was very early on in Breitling history. I mean, Breitling made pilot's watches, they made instruments for planes. And so it only made sense that, they would do the whole thing with, I think it was like John Travolta. He's a pilot, right? Or who was that guy? One of those guys. I think was it John Travolta? Yeah, it was. And he was a pilot, and he wore the Breitling, and it made a big splash, or boom, or whatever you want to call the equivalent of a splash in outer space. And basically, Breitling kind of they are the pilot's watch, right? They've got the Navitimer, they've got, the chronomat, everything around planes. Planes is Breitling. And there's groups of guys that really enjoy that. They love planes, they love everything about aviation, and they like that kind of sporty, like engine-driven thing, as well as they attempted with racing for a while. It didn't totally succeed with the Breitling Bentley, but the guy that likes planes buys Breitling, or sometimes IWC, right? I mean, IWC has a pilot's watch, and they were part of the Dirty Dozen, and they made pilot's watches. IWC is also known for this, but I would say that as time goes on, I'm seeing a lot less of these guys in the watch market for whatever reason, possibly tied to the rise and fall of Breitling. It's really tough. I have no idea why, but the guy that's drawn to the pilot's type watches, he's just kind of almost gone into Rolex sports category, right? Like, it was kind of like the cool watch collector thing for a while to do, is get into pilot's watches, and that kind of whole thing. And Breitling was very, very hot for a moment, but now Rolex sports models, steel, subs and all that have become very hot. And I think the kind of guy that was drawn to that, plus with the advent of credit and very easy credit terms in the United States, I think the kind of guy has transitioned more into Rolex sports models, from what I can see, as Rolex has really developed their position as the powerhouse of the sports model watch segment. So something I see, but nonetheless, there is still, kind of an aviation type watch guy that really likes IWC and Breitling. and very great watches, of course, so I can't knock that. Moving on to the perfectionist. Okay, now the perfectionist comes in many, many different shapes, sizes, and budgets and professions. The perfectionist is a watch collector that values so many things, but often valuing so many things can leave you to be making very difficult decisions when it comes to making purchases of luxury items or timekeeping items depending on the budget. So this is a guy that really values everything being perfectly in line and a conveyed message of extreme high attention to detail. Now, not always does this guy have the highest budget. Sometimes he has middle or lower budgets, so it can be difficult for this guy that wants extreme high attention to detail and cares about, you know, these kind of the mantra and the perceived notion that it was made with every single piece in line perfectly and, you know, the most testing in chronometer specs. That can be difficult to get into at a lower price range, you know, in the terms of hundreds of dollars. So in the terms of hundreds of dollars, this guy is typically drawn to Seiko, make great watches. For the money, it's as close to perfect as you can get. But as you go up, they quickly progress into Grand Seiko, which in recent times really, really blows me away in terms of quality. I mean, Grand Seiko does make as close to a perfect watch as possible for their price point that you can get to, right? I mean, I have not heard of any returns. It's almost like Grand Seiko doesn't do returns because they don't need to, because they put that much attention to detail into their watches. So whether or not you like Grand Seiko, it doesn't matter, because the guy that values perfection over everything else, over brand image, over, you know, having the craziest history, the craziest stories, people being able to determine what watches he's wearing and to be able to show off, it doesn't even matter. He cares about the perfection, and Grand Seiko delivers and executes on that perfectly. So you got the Grand Seiko guy, and then moving up, it overlaps with other categories, right? It overlaps with the movement guy, because when you get into a certain price point of watch, once again, we're talking about FP Journe and A. Lange & Söhne, movement-driven, very movement-focused and movement-centric watches, very high-end manufacturer in-house calibers, but they also decorate their watches crazy good. The decoration and the case finishing, it's just amazing. They spend so many hours, hundreds of hours in some cases, polishing these cases, different depending, especially the polishing of the movements with all the different types of movements and Coach de Genève and, you know, the Geneva stripes and all that stuff that goes into movement polishing is also carried out through the case. And so when you talk about FP Journe and A. Lange & Söhne, you'd start realizing that, you know, in the perlage on some of these watches, they spend so much time decorating, and the perfection is there, right? They're doing it by hand, and the guy that's into perfectionism and truly values that over brand image, it's a no-brainer when you get into that dollar point. But so basically, you're looking at Seiko, Grand Seiko, and then you get into the FP Journes and A. Lange & Söhne. Now, I know I covered a lot of categories here. I want to make sure I didn't miss any, because there's so many other stereotypes as well, right? I mean, you got the mainstream guys that are into the Rolex, you got kind of the bandwagon guys as well, and I mean, you got more sporty guys that like racing, that always buy the race car related stuff. I mean, there's so many of them, but the ones that I mentioned are the ones where, you know, if I answer the phone, hey, Delray Watch, and one of these scenarios comes up, you know right away, you know, usually what this guy is into. Now, there's going to be some of you that are going to say, like, I like this watch and I'm not this guy. Like, fine, perfectly fine. It's possible, especially when you get closer down the rabbit hole of being a watch savant, you get a little more choosy, right? Like, what I gave you is pretty much an over-level of stereotypes when the guy doesn't spend all day on YouTube. He doesn't spend all day in the forums. He's just a guy. He knows what he likes, and he buys what he likes, and he is what he is. And so that's based on my opinion, not anybody else's. You know, I'm drawing this from my experiences. So if you are one of these guys and you like perhaps a different watch, leave in the comments below the types of brands or the watches specifically that you're drawn to as being one of the guys, as being a lawyer, as being a doctor, as being a professional, as being a teacher. You know, we work with a lot of teachers. We work with some teachers that wear, like, you know, Hulks, Pateks and, crazy things as teachers. Everybody's scenario is different. Everybody has a different life story. And whether you're the guy that, perhaps saved up all through high school and you love watches, and, there's a local guy here, and, he's not a doctor or something, right? He's a young guy still in high school, but he saves up all of his money and he loves watches, and many of you know him. And so I don't like to talk about stereotypes as being definitive, because there's always the guy that truly loves watches and makes exceptions for himself and does what he loves. And so these people exist, and we shouldn't discredit or discount their experiences. So leave in the comments below kind of what you do, if you'd like to, what you do, the types of watches you're into. Maybe you like to play music. What kind of watches do you like? Maybe doctor, lawyer, teacher, anything else. Maybe you work at the front desk at a hotel and you really love watches and you want to save up. Leave below. I love hearing the stories, but I also want to see some confirmation or possibly destruction of my stereotypes that I've come up with, because I do find them to be pretty self-evident, and I think they're pretty good for the most part. Leave in the comments below. Don't hate me too much for covering the stereotypes. We won't do it again, but I had to do it because many of you find it interesting, and it's been a couple of questions on emails. I had to do it. Anyway, guys, this has been Chatting with John P. Have a great week. Let's kick off Monday in style. Go hard at whatever you're doing. Ciao.